This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'm delighted to be joined today by my two co-hosts, the magnificent Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Hello, guys. Lovely to be with you from Gadigal land.
And a man whose immune system is doing its best but losing the battle, Tenant Reid. G'day, Tenant.
Hello. I'm not sure if I have an immune system worthy of the name at all.
Well, thanks, mate, for being a trooper and joining us nevertheless. On this week's show, we unpack the most topical and, dare I say, controversial paper in Australian climate politics of at least this month, the Safeguard Mechanism consultation paper. But first we have some follow-up from last week's show from friend of the pod, Erwin Jackson, who listened with interest and expressed some nerd rage as to our broad congruence with the critique from Stern, Stiglitz and Taylor of integrated assessment models. And I think Erwin was keen to point out that actually IAMs have played a pretty productive part in the assessment of risk in the financial sector.
I thought it was good that he prefaced his nerd rage with he thought we broadly landed in the right spot, and that the key piece or the blind spot here we're really talking about is risk and extreme risk, and that these things don't deal with that well, and we know we need tools that are going to help us understand what the potential catastrophic impacts are of failing to address those risks. And he had some suggestions, or not. He referenced, I think, what he thought were really good approaches to use of IAMs that he'd come across, mostly done by, I think it was sort of European banks that he referenced.
And I guess his point was this has had really practical impacts in terms of the way that the financial sector thinks about climate through mechanisms like the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures. And so, you know, a really positive and material impact from IAMs. So, I don't know, Tenant, is the message from our friend Erwin not to throw the baby out with the bathwater?
I'm going to pass up the opportunity to de-escalate, and I'm going to double down aggressively.
Yeah, this is how we start sort of flame wars on the podcast, which will no doubt juice our numbers.
We're feuding with the investor group on climate change. So I think that just because you can make a positive use of the stuff that these models spit out is not the same as the models actually being worth a damn in themselves as something that you can really intellectually rely on. Like the Pythian oracle in a cave inhaling smoke and intoning predictions is not a great basis for your decision making, even if she says past performance is no guide to future returns. Says, hey, maybe not such a good idea to invade your fellow Greek city-state or whatever.
Hang on, I've lost you. Can you bring us home?
It's the fever talking. The point is you can use a predictive tool that is fundamentally bollocks to support a good position or a bad position, but you still should look elsewhere if you want something to actually guide your own thinking.
All right, Erwin, there we go.
I mean, I agree. I agree with Tennant. Sorry, Erwin. But I think but the reference to 1.5, I would really like to unpack a little more. I mean, we talked about the guardrails approach and, really the fact that nation states landed on that being the scenario we should drive at. Through reasoning around avoiding the worst possible impacts and having an appreciation of that, and it not really being driven by IAMs. And so to what extent it influenced the financial sector along those lines, like I can't speak with authority on that, but it's not the thing that drove the ultimate outcome from the Paris Agreement.
Okay, well, Erwin, I'm not sure what you going to do with that. I tried to bring us all together, have a Kumbaya moment, but it's been blown up by a feverish T. Reid. So I will no doubt look forward to further feedback on IAMs.
Luke alone will be spared the Force lightning.
It's okay, we needed to replace Gas Crisis Corner with IAM Crisis Corner.
Yes, the new recurring segment on the show. All right. It is time to talk about the safeguard mechanism consultation, which to the uninitiated could seem like a pretty dry technical document, but is actually freighted with a decade of turmoil in Australia's climate policy. So we better tread carefully, team.
We should, but wouldn't it be great if we had a battle-worn expert who's seen all this happen over the last 10 years and could kind of set the scene for us?
Who just happens to be hiding under a blanket and turned up on a Zoom call.
Those dulcet tones are very familiar.
Oh, my goodness.
Luke, who's joined us?
Guardian political editor Catherine Murphy, how did you get on this call?
Oh, well, I don't know. I heard there was a good chat about the safeguard mechanism going to happen and I just couldn't resist.
We set up whatever the equivalent of the emissions-obsessed journalist bat signal is and you appeared in your cowl.
That is exactly right. It's sort of the post-traumatic stress of all of this is so significant. It's sort of like a cloud, that touches down on the earth, picks up loads of people and puts them down in different locations. So, I heard that we needed to ventilate some PTSD about climate policy. So here I am, guys. Thanks for having me.
We are absolutely here for that, as our regular listeners would know. Shall we unpack a report?
We should. But we should also prepare ourselves for pre-traumatic stress disorder.
Buckle in, guys.
Since 2016, the safeguard mechanism has been the sleeping giant of Australia's climate policy architecture. The mechanism applies to facilities with Scope 1 emissions of more than 100,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. It requires these 215 facilities to keep their emissions below a baseline. However, the baselines set to date have been so generous that the vast majority of businesses have succeeded in meeting them without any particular effort or expense. However, the sleeping giant is stirring, with the newly elected Albanese government putting the safeguard mechanism at the heart of its emissions reduction efforts. The government has just released a consultation paper setting out how it is proposing to put the safeguard mechanism to work. But before we get into that, Catherine, how on earth did a climate policy designed by Greg Hunt become the centrepiece of the newly elected Labor government's emissions reduction agenda?
Oh, my God. I mean, where do you even start with that? But look, let's have a go. Look, we've ended up here because we tried everything else, I guess. I think that's the sort of short version. We've had so many iterations of climate policy during the climate wars over the last sort of 10 plus years. Look, we could actually just do a whole show actually listing the amount of or the number of mechanisms that have been invoked at various times by various individuals.
There's a graveyard of 3-letter acronyms strewed around us.
And we've all had to get across all of them and none of them were ever implemented. Oh, well, some of them were implemented but then repealed. But anyway, let's not do that. In terms of why we're here with the safeguard, I suppose the answer to that is the last 2 election cycles. In the election before this one, Labor attempted to sort of try and sue for peace in the climate wars by proposing the National Energy Guarantee as a mechanism for reducing emissions in one sector, electricity. That was a coalition policy. But by that stage, or by the time the Labor Party said, well, actually, we'll do your thing, actually, the architect of that scheme, Malcolm Turnbull, was out and Scott Morrison was in. So the Liberal Party wasn't very interested in, well, any sort of settlement, really, on climate policy at all. So then that's the last election cycle. That's 2019. Now, this election cycle, the Labor Party went through all the rounds of hell on climate policy, as they do. I think after the election result in 2019, there was a very significant internal discussion in Labor about, would we stick with climate ambition or not? If the answer to that is yes, then what's our mechanism? What's our preferred mechanism? And it took them, I think, a couple of years really to land on the safeguard as being the preferred mechanism for reducing pollution reducing emissions in the industrial sector. So, and again, it was sort of like the Labor Party trying to work with a coalition framework in an effort to sort of get the Liberal and National parties back to the table, at least, to some degree. But anyway, we did have this rather odd period in the sort of 6 months before the last election where we had Angus Taylor calling the safeguard mechanism a carbon tax, that his own mechanism. I mean, sorry to invoke these bad scenes for all of us, but anyway, that happened.
We're all processing a lot of trauma from the last 10 years, Catherine. This is a safe space.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I feel safe here underneath my blanket.
Look, I think we need to pause and explain the blankets, because you've mentioned them a couple of times now. Look, Tennant has made a habit of recording under a blanket, which we thought was very funny, but now we can't make fun of him anymore because eminences as grand as Catherine Murphy have a similar approach.
Let's just say we all do audio on the fly. Normally I record my podcast in my purpose-built studio in my office, but I'm on a writing sabbatical at the moment, and I live in a sparsely populated house. So in order to sort of not be orally offensive to the lovely listeners of this podcast, that everyone's being treated to the side of me under a blanket. But anyway, that's the short version.
I'd just like to put it on record that Luke and Frankie, you are the odd ones out. The ordinary salt of the earth people of Australia do their podcasting under blankets.
Bloody oath. Anyway, sorry, guys. Did I actually answer the safeguard question?
Well, where you were going, I think, Catherine, was, look, there was a moment, and I'll speak for myself, I won't speak for the others, it was pretty clear that the then Labor opposition was moving towards adopting the safeguard mechanism as their kind of the centrepiece of their climate policy. And I, for one, was very hopeful that the then Liberal government coalition government would take that as an opportunity to rally around a central mechanism in the context of, a commitment to net zero emissions, which was hard won internally. Yeah. Unfortunately, as you say, that isn't what happened, but Labor stuck to their guns and said, well, we've won an incredible cross-section of support for this as the central policy. The most notable, I guess, organisation that backed this one in and took a different position than they did in 2019 was, of course, the Business Council of Australia.
A remarkable turnaround.
And to some degree, at least, it's an interesting to reflect on how the role that climate played in the election in 2022, because on one level it was the whole thing, and we've obviously got this incredible progressive majority for climate action in the Australian Parliament, but in another sense, the two major parties, it felt like neither of them wanted to talk about it that much.
They were trying to diffuse it.
Yeah, it was really interesting, actually. The sort of I think one of the most interesting stories, really, from election cycle to election cycle is how climate was weaponised one way in 2019 and then weaponised in the opposite direction in 2022 in only 3 years. It's really a remarkable turnaround. And yes, as Tennant said, I think that both sides, both of the major parties, sort of had outgoing and incoming on climate change, if I can express it that way. Scott Morrison was sort of trying to do a sort of pivot on climate policy because the moderate wing of the Liberal Party was under siege in metropolitan contests, and in fact a lot of those people ended up being wiped out by the Teal independents. So Morrison was sort of trying to talk more constructively about climate action, but of course the National Party was continuing to weaponise climate action in regional contests. And then the Labor Party was so, I think, what is the word I'm looking for? Shattered after 2019, after their experience where they thought there was a sort of progressive majority for climate action. It proved there was not such a progressive majority. That required a whole lot of soul searching and a whole lot of thinking. It sort of goes to the general point, though. We're talking about why the safeguard mechanism, why have we woken up in this strange universe where the Labor Party is now promulgating Greg Hunt's Abbott-era emissions reduction policy, well, it's sort of the sum of its parts, I think, is the answer to that. We're here because of all of the kind of crazy, unhinging that's happened over the last 10 years. And also, to your point, Luke, about the sort of shift in the business community, I think that's been really critical in sort of getting purchase around the safeguard mechanism as the place that we've all ended up. It's sort of like, I think about it as being in a forest on a freezing night and people are moving from campfire to campfire, right? In the desperate hope of not dying, basically, right? Like, can we stay alive for 5 more minutes? And we've reached the last campfire, which is the safeguard mechanism. Now, I'll tell the listeners a little tiny secret. I've devoted a lot of reporting hours to climate policy, but I must confess, I had this little private agreement with myself on the mechanism, bouncing from mechanism to mechanism. I said to myself about 3 years ago, there's no way that we'll ever end up with safeguard. So I'm not going to even bother getting across the intricacies of that, because there's absolutely no way the story ends here. And boom, here we are, guys. Safeguard mechanism.
New and improved.
Time to get immersed in production variables and all the micro detail that's bound up in it.
We can safely say the safeguard mechanism, the Stephen Bradbury of Australian climate policies.
Absolutely. It's the last fire in the forest, guys. We've reached the last fire in the forest.
All right, you've done a marvellous job teeing it up for us. Tenant, safeguard mechanism, how does it actually work?
It's got 3 components, actually. One of them deals with the electricity sector. Government's not proposing to change that one. The other 2 components deal with existing facilities in industry, mining, domestic aviation. And the third component deals with new facilities in those sectors, if they are large emitting facilities in all cases. And what it does is, for existing facilities, it sets baselines for emissions from those facilities, for their direct emissions from burning coal or gas or leaking high global warming potential gases. And it says you can't go above those baselines, sort of. And if you do, you've got to take steps to go below by buying offsets or by doing stuff to your facility that brings you below. And for the new facilities, it describes a system of benchmarks for what a best practice new facility is on emissions, but no benchmarks have ever been issued. And more broadly, the safeguard was always clearly a potential vehicle for driving emissions reductions. But ever since it was put in place, it's it's a vehicle that's been up on blocks on the front lawn with no wheels and no engine and not being asked to do anything. And now it's going to be asked to do something, and potentially something quite big based on what's in this discussion paper, which we should say is open at the time that we're recording, and for a few weeks longer. It's open for input. Dear listeners, you can go and make a submission on this paper, and we'll put the link to the paper itself in the show notes. You should get into it because there's going to be more, but this is the point at which it's the most wide open to have a go.
And I think those who are engaged in this in their day-to-day will have an opportunity to attend a series of roundtables that are going to be held around the country as well to do deep dives. So, dare I say it, we're going to see lots of nerds locked in rooms together to hark back to our last podcast discussion about how we solve complex problems.
So one of the things those nerds will be talking about is the first question that this paper poses is what proportion of the emissions reduction task that Australia has committed itself to in its recently updated NDC, 43% emissions reduction by 2030. There you go. What percentage of that should be delivered by the safeguard mechanism itself, which is an interesting question because it's asking a question about what the appropriate role of those entities is in the absence of any sort of broader government policy about what the decarbonisation trajectories for any other part of the economy should be.
It's tricky because in an ideal world, you'd be having this conversation in parallel with sectoral targets being put in place for other sectors of the economy that are also going to be doing their bit. I mean, I guess we could touch on lots of literature out there. We've covered parts of the IPCC report before that make a case for different sectors of the economy moving faster earlier because the technology is available and here and ready, and I represent one of those sectors. We don't need newfangled technology to decarbonise buildings. We need energy efficiency, fuel switching and a decarbonised grid. So we can do that today, but we don't have the policies in place to drive that. So I think it's a fraught question to be putting out there if the government's also not, at the same time saying we plan on having sectoral targets for these other significant parts of the economy that also need to carry their share. And because these entities represent some of the hardest to abate sectors, I'm sure there will be a conversation on whether they should take their mathematical, proportion of that total, or whether they should be given slightly more lenient treatment, given they are the harder to abate parts of the economy.
So it's not quite put as a government position in the paper, but it's the only method of dividing up this task that the paper refers to is basically pro rata, that the emissions reductions for the safeguard entities, which are in a bunch of sectors, they're not really a sector, which makes things a bit confusing and complicated for us. But the proportion, they've got about 28% of national emissions today, and the nation's got to cut its emissions 43% by 2030, so they should still have a 28% share of what the national emissions are in 2030, and that means they need to cut from 137 million tonnes last year to 99 million tonnes in 2030. But that's also complicated because some of them plan to grow and add more facilities that will have more emissions during that period, so the total cut that's involved is larger than that 137 down to 99 implies. You could come up with any number of other bases, but unless somebody provides one, it sounds like that's what they're going with, which then raises the question, well, if it's something else, what impact does that have? If it's a higher number that they're asked to do, what does that do to everybody else? And if it's a lower number, what does that do?
And it's sort of, it's sort of getting back to the sort of last campfire in the forest absurdity. It's sort of like it's the policy you have when the policy dare not speak its name. That's sort of where we are at this point in time, right? The only way Labor felt as though it could not lose another election was to have these have things that are not ambiguous, i.e., the set of commitments around the safeguard and that was sort of fleshed out by the Reputex modelling and all of that sort of stuff, right? Have knowns and then have a whole bunch of ambiguities, basically, about what happens. It drives me bonkers, right? I'm a first best policy person. I'm a, abatement at least cost via any technology person. Can you imagine, how bad the last 10 years has been for me, let alone the rest of the country, right? So it's like, oh my God, how many times can you do this crap? But the point is, there was a bunch of stuff that Labor didn't flesh out prior to the election. Labor has now legislated a 43% emissions reduction target for 2030. Now, I follow this stuff inside out, backwards, through several cul-de-sacs, up 48 mountains, and I cannot tell your listeners exactly how we're going to reduce emissions by 43% by 2030. Because the government hasn't told us how we're going to reduce emissions by 43% by 2030. It's it's not a totally open question. Obviously, as Tennant was saying before, there's this sort of glancing, well, everybody does their prorated bit, which sort of takes us back to possibly the Finkel type disposition where everybody was arbitrarily prorated all around the place, even though to Frankie's point, or abatement is much cheaper in some sectors than others, right? We're in this strange sort of halfway house between knowing something and knowing everything, I guess. So,
I mean, there was a sort of a settlement that included everyone except the coalition before the last election. The coalesced around this idea that, we can all live with the safeguard, and it goes to your point around, first, second, third, fourth, fifth or sixth best policy. And maybe it is the sixth best policy. One can argue about that, and people of goodwill will disagree. But it's something that we can all get behind. It will allow us to agree on something, and the other thing we agree on is that we'll work out the details later because we've got to get through, the next election. And so I share some of your frustration, Catherine, but I also have a certain amount of enthusiasm that we've got to the bit where we can actually have the wonky discussion about how the thing's designed and that it might plausibly do something real in the world at some point in the next couple of years, right?
Yeah. No. That's all true. I just wish, look, there's no point. I mean, there's no point in wishing for this because the universe is gone. It's done. It's over. We've left. It can't be retrieved, right? But there was a point in time where we could have designed this all quite elegantly, and that time has long since passed. But as you say, though, there's a bunch of really interesting, nitty-gritty granular discussion that's going to happen about the how of the 43%. And look, the safeguard mechanism, I was going to say, is it that bad? And then I thought, yes. But anyway, it can be fixed, though. It can be fixed.
And one of the features of climate policy is that there's a lot of common DNA between every kind of proposal out there, and it doesn't take, too many changes to make one thing work very much like another thing. The safeguard mechanism and the emissions reduction fund, which is now going to become the powering the regions fund, these things had features of carbon prices and features of carbon caps. They weren't structured to achieve very much, but if you do a nip and a tuck here and there, you can get something that works actually pretty well. There's a question for us all, though, of is it now possible and constructive to talk openly and in an easily understandable manner about what these things are and how they work? If we start talking, this paper doesn't talk about, efficient equalisation of carbon prices that emerge out of the behaviour of safeguard entities or whatever. But that kind of way of analysing it is very important. If we do all need to still be in a defensive crouch of, if you call a spade, the spade's going to get bombed from space.
Well, isn't the spade just going to hit you in the head real hard?
Sideshow Bob stepping on a rake again and again and again.
I think it's going to hit you in the head myself. But anyway, sorry, as you were, Tennant.
Quite likely. If we can't talk about these things as they are, then we're going to have a much harder time designing them to do a good job.
Yeah.
I also want to maintain, and I feel like you can't actually work in this space unless you're an optimist at heart, because how else do you go on?
That is true. It is true.
So I look at the makeup of this parliament and think, well, it actually hasn't taken that long. Like, the election was end of May, and we're already talking about emission vehicle standards again, a couple of months later. So, and you know what? The world isn't burning down. We can have that conversation.
What do you mean? You mean the weekend hasn't ended?
That's right. They haven't come for their utes. There's not like a yard where we're stockpiling people's utes. It's not coming to pass. So I wonder whether, some of these policy areas are proving grounds, and with the parliament that we've got and the work that I know we all engage with Zali Steggall's bill, there's frameworks out there that provide the bare bones for for building on that. So the legislation that's passed could be revisited, and we could start talking about sectoral targets and legislating them. I remain optimistic. I think the thing I'm wary of, or sort of worry about, is we've got all of these different mechanisms for creating certificates, not just at the federal level but at the state level. So I think state government action over the last 10 years, where they really stepped up in the vacuum of leadership absentia from the Commonwealth, means that there are a whole bunch of systems that need to be talking to each other, and having a lot of those things is inefficient and create sort of additional burden that need not be there. But to our conversation...
Frankie, are you proposing a new Wilkins review to take a blowtorch to the amalgamation of policy barnacles on the good ship emissions reduction?
I dare not. I was not going to speak its name, but at some point those things need to be reckoned with.
I think there's a trust deficit that if you get rid of something, the thing that's meant to be doing its job is going to stick around.
Well, we have this problem. We have this conversation about white certificate schemes all the time. A single national energy efficiency scheme is far preferable to 3 state schemes.
All right.
A lack of... Anyway, sorry.
Friend of the podcast, Alison Reeve, is entering a catatonic fugue state at the mention of this right now.
Let's get back on track. I digress.
You do digress. This area has more rabbit holes than a Beatrix Potter box set, and we're avoiding them. We're not going to start a debate about nationalising white certificate schemes, but there is a segue
Aren't
there.
We though?
There is a segue, right? The credit unit that we know and love, affectionately known as ACCUs, their proposal is that they be joined by an SMC?
Safeguard Mechanism Credit.
There you go. So, and that the Safeguard Mechanism entities will have access to both of these opportunities to acquit their responsibilities under the scheme. Who wants to unpack what an SMC is?
Oh, I'd love to.
I'm shocked.
So crediting below baseline, that is, if you've got a baseline and you do better than it, you get a credit for that you can use yourself later or sell to someone else, is an absolutely central part of this whole policy design for an evolved safeguard. Because if you didn't have that, and you didn't have the thing that I think a few listeners of this podcast will have some doubts about, to say the least, which is the access to the domestic offsets, the Australian carbon credit units. If you didn't have either of those things, if the baselines were just coming down gradually over time, most big industrial sites, their emissions reductions are not smooth like that. Like, yes, there's some year-on-year improvement in efficiency for some processes some of the time, but really what we're talking about is big, lumpy, transformational investments that change the whole production process. So that you're, say, taking a blast furnace for making steel and you're shutting it down and you're replacing it with a hydrogen direct reduction of iron process. And so that's going to be, emissions bumble along more or less at the same level, and then suddenly they're way down. So the time when that's possible, the cycle of replacing assets, all these things are different from site to site, sector to sector. If you just did a smooth reduction, then you'd produce enormously high marginal costs of abatement at a point in time for some sites, and you'd be giving a really free ride to others. And what crediting below baseline does is it allows you to equalise marginal costs of abatement, very economistic, old-timey carbon pricing language, and get an efficient trajectory across the whole sector. And politically and opinion-wise, what this does is it means that it no longer matters much who can do emissions reduction. If somebody says, well, I can't at this moment, look at my options, they're really bad. What matters is can you pay for someone whether it's yourself or somebody else, can you bear the cost of emissions reduction if they're as like the same level across the whole covered sectors? And that makes it just much easier to deal with the kinds of objections that people have had. But, of course, you will have people saying, well, are we crediting nothing? Are these credits meaningful or not? And that plugs into a few other parts of this.
Well, I think the important thing to understand about SMCs is that they're only tradable within the safeguard mechanism entities themselves.
As currently proposed, yes.
And the way that you get an SMC is by making actual emissions reduction against your baseline, however that's defined, which is another question, and that's automatically generated, I guess, by the Clean Energy Regulator.
It does need to be as automatic as possible, because the less automatic it is, like you need to get an audit done to prove that you're good or whatever, the more it starts to be like the current emissions reduction fund, which in this regard, industrial emissions reductions, nobody has really wanted to deal with the complexity of that. It becomes another offsetting scheme. And
there are pains to point out the simplicity of this relative to the experience under the ERF. So SMCs are sort of, they're relatively contained and, to my mind at least, relatively sensible as a mechanism and make a bit of sense. And there's this other element, which is the ability to access the ACCU market. And I feel like the conversation around the safeguard mechanism that, we're all a part of and that is, running pretty hot on Twitter, it's kind of getting very tied up in another debate, an adjacent debate around the veracity of ACCUs and their role in the market and how robust they are, right?
So I think it is worth us flagging, and a lot of the listeners of the pod will know this, but there have been concerns raised with the integrity of certain methods used under the IRF, predominantly the human-based regeneration activities, which is, planting trees, mostly on farmland. And a little while prior to the election, you had a guy called Andrew McIntosh who headed the it was sort of like the audit committee charged with overseeing the integrity of the ERF with the Clean Energy Regulator, effectively come out as a whistleblower and say, I've raised these concerns, I don't see them being addressed. I think there are serious questions over the integrity of vast swathes of ACCUs out in the market. And he called on a review, and he suggested that the relevant methods be paused while that review was ongoing. Now, Labor committed to doing a review in the lead up to the election, and they have since appointed Ian Chubb, former chief scientist, to lead that review. But they've been sort of beavering around in the background, and there's not a public-facing component to that review yet. So that's sort of all still to play out, and there will be implications from that review. But in the meantime, those projects continue to generate ACCUs, and I can foresee some bumpy road ahead, depending on what comes out of that inquiry.
We actually do need firms to reduce emissions, right? Like if everyone purchases abatement off the shelf, and if some of that abatement is entirely dodgy, well, the planet fries. Like let's just be clear about what happens. But obviously, some firms will have difficulty. For all the reasons that have been ventilated, in doing that instantly. Or investment cycles mean that plant upgrades occur in year 3 rather than year 1 or whatever, right? So there's obviously got to be flexibility in the system for people to be able to buy abatement. Like, if you're into least cost emissions reduction, that's part of the system. I think if we look at what Chris Bowen's been saying to date, obviously, without departing from this idea that a lot of climate policy is completely ambiguous at this point in time, which it is, I think Bowen's language, though, has certainly to my ear suggests that the government actually wants people to reduce emissions.
Yep.
Right? I think if we sort of listen to what he says, that's a pretty consistent sort of backdrop to his observations about various things. So Look, I think if Ian Chubb comes back and basically says the whole system's a disaster, God knows what's going to happen. I mean, seriously, like that's massive. And Andrew McIntosh is obviously a very, very respected figure in this field and knows more about this than pretty much anyone, right? And I just want to very quickly shout out to my colleague, Adam Morton at The Guardian, who's done some really excellent journalism on this. So, look, we're really in, we're in deep doo-doo if the whole system is just a joke. But, but obviously we have to have a functioning credit system. I think if we listen to Bowen, it's part of the mix rather than all of the mix. And, and I guess, the rest we'll just see what happens.
So my sort of mantra on this is that offsets are going to play a role, right? But, they're finite and they're precious. And so they need to be preserved for the industries that actually really, really need them. And so we need to do whatever we can in designing these policies to encourage those industries that, arguably don't need them to kind of lead the charge. And Frankie's referenced the opportunities that there are in the building sector to kind of get to something approximating zero operational emissions rather than relying on offsets for some sort of residual emissions from gas or whatever. So that's sort of one thing. In terms of the ACCUs, I think that to the degree there are issues, and I suppose that process and review is underway and that will emerge, I think it's absolutely fabulous that we're having a good hard look at them because we need confidence in that market and we need it stat. And so there's two things that could emerge from that. There could be, concerns might be overblown and comfort is restored, or there's reforms that, are the basis for comfort moving forward. Those reforms could well mean that it's harder to create ACCUs and more expensive to create ACCUs than it has been in the past, right? Yes. And so a lot of the concern around offsetting is, on the basis of cheap offsets, right? Yeah. And that's associated with the idea that perhaps they're a bit squidgy. And so that could shift. The other thing that could drive prices up in the ACCU market is 215 odd companies suddenly being in the market for a bunch of ACCUs, right?
40 to 50 megatons a year of extra demand by late this decade.
I don't know any company that's factoring in cheap offsets towards the back end of 2030. No one thinks ACCUs are going to get massively cheaper. At least the businesses I talk to. And so what it means is it's accelerating planning around the alternatives on emissions reduction, fuel switching primarily in my area, rather than sticking with gas and offsetting. But absolutely. And I just want to come back to the other point around sort of revisiting the conversation we had earlier around carbon claims in one of our earlier episodes.
I was thinking about that too.
Yep. Yeah. And so I actually really liked the suggestion in this paper that we should consider mechanisms promoting transparency of ACCUs. So that's one thing that I actually do think allowing, just lifting the veil more on what companies are actually doing will drive a certain amount of scrutiny. And from an investor perspective, you put two otherwise identical businesses together and one presents you a plan for reducing their emissions by changing their processes and all that versus the other one proposing to use offsets. And I can tell you which is the preferable investment to make. So, I just commend the focus on transparency. I think that will be well received. And if we start seeing, there are a range of not-for-profits that will jump on that and do public benchmarking of, companies within sectors and league tables and all that. And I think that will play a really important role in establishing credibility.
Shall we talk about emissions-intensive trade-exposed entities?
I can hardly wait. But I do have one final thing to mention about the credits part.
Okay.
Which is that the crediting below baseline is the one piece of all this that needs fresh legislation. That doesn't really get discussed in the paper, but to have a tradable property right in these units, we'll need a bit of law in the parliament. So if there's going to be fights and flashpoints and whatnot, that's the bit that the government absolutely needs to get through if this thing is going to function in an efficient way.
Which was sort of elided pre-election, I feel like. There was this idea that was prosecuted that they'd just be able to get on with it if the Parliament wasn't coming to the party. But as you say, Tennant, that chunk of it, which I remember talking to you about last year, this wasn't some great state secret, if it was to be pursued, would require some kind of fresh legislation. What's your view on that, Catherine? Do you think that legislative pathway is a smooth one, or is it likely to hit some snags along the way?
The minister said it's bipartisan, so it should be fine.
Oh, yes, here I've got a safeguard I'd like to sell you. I guess it remains to be seen. Some of that is going to have to be legislated. Then we're into the dynamics of what happens in the Senate. And so on one side of the fence, we've got the Liberal Party sort of weighing up how it approaches this term. Right, it is extraordinary that the Liberal and National parties sort of, the take-home message they got from the election was dig in and be even more stupid on climate change. Like, that is like beyond cognitive dissonance. That's somewhere in, I don't even know what you call that. But even they now, I think Peter Dutton probably has worked out, perhaps that wasn't that smart, even though I'm keeping my options open to still weaponise climate action in this cycle. We've got to look a little bit less stupid than this. Therefore, now you have sort of senior people in the Liberal and National Party saying, well, of course we'll revisit our policy prior to the election and, we may not have this ridiculous position. So I guess that's a slightly long-winded answer that says the safeguard mechanism legislation does give the coalition, a seat back at the table if it chooses to sue for semi-peace. I guess the other thing is the Greens and how this whole sort of element of the moratorium on oil and gas will play out through the sort of future climate policies and legislation that the new government tries to bring through the Parliament. So the Greens obviously supported the targets legislation, even though they wanted a more ambitious target, and they wanted other bells and whistles for which Labor has no electoral mandate. The Greens will double back and try and get a chunk of change out of the government at every stage of this legislation. So at one level, if you're Chris Bowen, you might hope that the coalition has sort of, come out of its trance by the time the safeguard legislation hits the Parliament. It might be an easier pathway than the Greens plus Pocock, but anyway, nobody should bet the house on the coalition coming out, waking up from this trance.
Since you mentioned, I might go to the whole question around new entrants, because there's a fairly neat interaction, right, between some of the moratoria that the Greens are proposing and how new entrants might be treated under such a scheme, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. So there's a few different ways to skin that cat, potentially. And there's also, in terms of the moratoria, there's also, whether or not through the separate process that the Labor Party is or the government is running over the reform of the EPBC Act, whether or not there's any countenancing or climate trigger in the EPBC Act legislation, which would be a moratorium by another means. So, all of that has got the rest of the term really to play out, and it's very hard to predict at the moment how any of that stuff's going to land.
Well, in terms of that new entrance piece in this consultation paper, it struck me that there was quite a lot of thinking out loud around how new entrants might be accommodated. And this could be new entities that are sort of entering and meeting that 100,000-tonne threshold, or it could be just expansion of existing production. Yeah. Like, those are the two scenarios that are being contemplated here.
This is a really important issue because it plugs into so many other parts of how this thing's going to function. Because, what we know is that there are a number of new entrants planned for this decade and next decade, and they are coal mines and gas facilities and LNG facilities. And they're going to have a bunch of emissions. They can do things to reduce those emissions through CCS, through more efficient power generation, a whole bunch of things. But even with all that, they're still going to have a bunch of emissions. And so if the whole scheme needs to deliver that 99 megatons and no higher, for example, emissions in 2030, then either those new entrants make life more difficult for everybody else within the safeguard because everybody's baselines have to come down faster to take account of that extra demand or extra emissions, or the new entrants have got a tough run with a low baseline. And the paper is having a bet each way, really. It raises two options as potentially viable. You give them a benchmark based on best Australian practice, the top 10% best facilities, or you give them a benchmark based on industry average. But either way, you keep cutting that every year, like the existing facility baselines. And then they say, and somebody proposed this other thing where you do an averaging, and it sounds bad. So they've discarded it. They don't raise two ideas that are also out there, which is global best practice. What's the best coal mine in the world? And they don't raise zero. If you're new, you get a benchmark of zero. Zero might be harsh for some. It might be less harsh for others. But there's more to come here. And in part, this is important because going back to the crediting discussion, some entities are going to be short of carbon and some entities are going to be long on potential abatement. And there's going to be flows of like some businesses paying for other businesses' decarbonisation based on who's short and who's long. And that might play through to who's in whose ear in the Senate about voting for stuff too. You could get an outcome where the decarbonisation of industries that have a future is paid for by industries that don't, but are very profitable until they cease to have a future. And I'm going to leave it at that gnomic utterance. Wasn't
that gnomic, was it?
I prefer to pretend that it is.
I think we all heard what you said there, Tennant. I'm just saying. Sorry to mention the elephant in the room, but I think we all heard you.
Look, we got to get there, and we're running long, but we have to talk about emissions-intensive trade exposed.
Save the best for last.
Well, indeed.
Everybody's favourite topic. Except Tristanitis.
Well, that's right. Tristanitis on Twitter is like, really do we have to do this again? Harking back to the late 2000s where this was all we could talk about for, I don't know, like 4 years or something. But here we are again. This remains something that is of significant concern to the businesses involved, but I think it's also fair to say that the situation has shifted somewhat over the subsequent decade. I think there is at least a top level strategic consensus that the global economy is on a certain trajectory. There's also a realism emerging around what the expectations of some of our key trading partners are going to be moving forward. Frankie mentioned the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is in the midst of trilogue, Tennant, as you told us a couple of episodes ago, and is showing still chugging along.
But it's clearly going to happen.
So there are actually pressures in the other direction as well in terms of the competitiveness of industry, and less intensive products are actually going to have potentially a competitive advantage as we move through the next couple of decades. So it's a bit more complicated than it was, but nevertheless, it is something that the government is very mindful of, and it proposes 3 or 4 really different ways that one could support those sectors along the way, right?
They say this is a non-exhaustive list, and it's good they did say that because there's 2 things they left off the list, at least, that occur to me. One is the idea of an Australian carbon border adjustment mechanism. We don't just need to quake in fear of what the Europeans do to us. We could get out there and do it unto them. And I think that's probably not going to get a serious consideration this time, but we might be having a real discussion about it for Safeguard 3 in 3 or 4 years' time.
Well, I think it's worth unpacking that, Tennant, because I feel like we're still in the process of literacy building around the old CBAMs in Australia, and they kind of the acronym gets thrown around, but I'm not sure everyone's quite got their head around what it is.
It's whatever you want it to be.
I'm sorry. Honestly, you said we're running long, but we should really tackle ETs. And you've just given Tennant the floor to talk
Crank
about.
Me up and watch me go.
3 hours.
Look,
past.
he's just skipped over the 3 or 4 options that are actually in the paper, which are clearly rubbish, and gone straight to his favourite. So I guess I figured rubbish. He could use his time with the conch to unpack the CBAM.
Yeah. So the fear here is that if you're making stuff in Australia and you're bearing a carbon cost and your competitor isn't overseas, then maybe you're going to be less profitable, or maybe you're going to be less competitive, and maybe you close or move there and nothing much good is achieved. And that's always been the fear. And the same fear is felt in all these other countries that are doing things, and they're all doing things to try to prevent that fear. And the main things that they have been doing are giving emissions rights out for free. We did that under former carbon policies. Europe's doing that right now. California, China, Korea, everybody who's got a serious system is also seriously giving away a seriously large amount of emissions rights for free. And it's a bit unsatisfactory over time because the caps keep coming down. How much abatement you need keeps coming down. If things aren't changing in industry, then that free allocation will take up more and more share of the total units. And you get this conflict between, well, are we achieving our objectives or are we killing our industry? ET is the old free allocation process is kind of built into the safeguard mechanism, except that everybody gets it. Like the old thing was, well, if you were special, you got a free allocation that came down over time. And the new thing is everyone's special and everyone gets a free allocation that comes down over time. That's right. But are some more special than others? Is a question that the paper asks. And a CBAM is a different approach to the same problem. And it says, okay, there is going to be an unabated or a full strength carbon price signal within the domestic market. If you've got an emission, you've got a cost, but we're going to impose the equivalent cost on imports of products where there's a fear. And maybe this is not proposed. Well, actually, this might wind up happening in Europe. It wasn't part of the initial proposal, but maybe we'll do a rebate of carbon costs on exports. And the kind of products that we're talking about are like steel, cement, aluminium. LNG has previously been defined as an ET. Coal never was defined as an ET. But you want to not cause policy inequities or unevenness to wind up making industry move around rather than like who's actually good at making low emissions things.
I mean, the reason I think it's worth unpacking is because there's been all this concern / interest around the role of a CBAM in Europe, but less sort of unpacking of its implications for adopting one here in Australia. And if we collectively were to get our head around that and to explore that option, it could potentially ease some of the concerns, right? Because it's quite an elegant mechanism potentially for managing the impacts on trade exposed industries without, junking the integrity of the price that's being imposed, right?
Yeah, people have been thinking about CBAM as this sort of Damocles hanging over our head unless we do the right thing and start cutting emissions. But it's more like the Master Sword from The Legend of Zelda. It's dangerous to go alone. Here, take this.
I think you just won the podcast.
That's the intro right there. But can we just call out, it's really not trying to grapple with the thorniest part of this issue in the paper. It's
a bold call to name one thorniest part of this issue.
Well, I mean, when there's so much content about providing funding for technology upgrades, yes. I just feel the point's being missed a little bit there in terms of strategic positioning, and you get the feeling that they're just not quite ready to have that serious debate right now. And they're like, here, we can throw a bunch of money at you in the form of grants, which has a direct action-y type feel about it. So, you know, harking to climate policies past and present, as it seems. You know, I found it lacking.
I'm less concerned about that because there's these chunks of money that are sitting within the I guess the Powering Australia policy, the Powering the Regions Fund and the like, which are going to be allocated somewhere, and it sort of makes some intuitive sense that is aligned with the effort around the safeguard mechanism and supporting those businesses they're going to struggle without significant capital investments, and we're seeing that right around the world to some degree, like even in places which have quite robust sort of carbon regimes.
I'm not saying it's a bad thing. Of course, these kinds of measures need to be brought to bear, but is this taking a longer-term strategic view around how we position our industry when this government's also, making claims or articulating an ambition that we want to make stuff in this country again? It just seems like it's missing the opportunity to kick off that conversation.
But isn't this sort of phase of proceedings, though, it's sort of like, it's been a theme of this whole conversation, that in climate policy you can't pretend the last decade didn't happen. Like there's no way we can sort of decouple ourselves from that madness.
It'd take a lot more blankets to be under.
Well, just like a whole, I don't know, flock of blankets. I don't know what the collective, anyway, whatever. It would take, you can't get rid of it, right? So you've got, I guess I see the new Labor government as sort of still going through this process where they can't quite believe that they took a policy on climate change that suggested somebody actually had to reduce emissions and they didn't lose. Right? They've lost every election since 2013, like on this area. So I think there will be some embedded old thinking, like, if we sort of talk about the sort of, the kind of hard rules of climate policy, right? Who kills you if you're a government? Which sector kills you? Which sector wields the power to kill a government? ETs, that's the sector. How do we get them to reduce emissions? Give them money. I mean, isn't it sort of about as complicated as that, or not complicated as that? I mean, obviously we would all wish for something better than that. And, as you say, Frankie, like there's a whole lot of objectives here that one could, if one was sort of trying to maximise policy outcomes, there would be better ways to do it. But I think this is sort of round one of a whole kind of sequence of policy making that's going to have to play out really over this term and the next one.
And it's important to say, Catherine, that the success of the initial foray builds momentum for subsequent sort of ambition and efforts. And so, while we could, express frustration around, the constraints around this effort, it's important to get it right, and it's important to build that consensus in the centre of politics to the degree that's possible. And I understand there's a tension that with the urgency of the task that we face, but ultimately, we've got to bring society more broadly along for that journey. And so I guess that's the tightrope that the government's on, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And there was sort of, it's going to take a while, I think, just to build that sort of baseline of confidence back, given what's happened. So I think, the government's very focused on, let's get some things in motion. Let's show the people of Australia that the world doesn't end when you've got a policy to reduce emissions. Let's sort of prove that this is okay. And from that foundation, lots of things can happen.
Catherine Murphy, Guardian political editor, thank you so much for being with us. It's been an absolute delight. Come back anytime.
I will come back anytime. Beware of what you wish for.
hold you to that, you know.
But Frankie and Luke, that means that you need to get thematically appropriate blankets.
Oh, so we all need blankets now.
Exactly.
Solidarity.
Exactly.
We can have our Murpharoo blanket parties moving forward.
Oh, dear.
All right, it's time for one more thing, where we usually all share something that's currently captivating our attention. But on this occasion, given we have gone quite long with the marvellous Murpharoo, I'm going to propose that our one more thing is thank you, Catherine.
Much appreciated.
It was a pleasure to have her along for the pod, and a delight to have the benefit of her many years, although it did feel like something of a therapy session at different points in the conversation. For all of us, to be clear.
She's welcome to the group therapy session anytime. And I feel like that extends to our listeners as well.
Yes, indeed. We're all in this together. Well, that is our show for today. If you have comments, questions, or something you want to cover on a future episode, you can hit us up on Twitter. Frankie is at Frankie Muscovich. Tennant is at Tennant Reid. My handle is at Luke Menzel. And I feel like Catherine Murphy probably needs a bit of a boost to her Twitter following. She's been working away at it at Murpharoo. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to Let Me Sum Up in your podcast app of choice, and you'll find this and all future episodes at letmesumup.net. But for Frankie Muscovich, Tennant Reid and Catherine Murphy, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.